Hello and welcome to the 10-minute Bible study. Today we're going to begin to look at Mark chapter 4 together. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab it and let's dive in. In this section, Jesus begins to teach using parables. We're going to talk about parables in just a second, but first, a word about the context. Jesus is still in Capernaum. He's caused quite a fuss there. The scribes are unhappy. His parents and family, they're getting involved, trying to pull him away, and the crowds are pressing in on him. More and more people are coming to check out Jesus, to see what he's about, to try to get something from him, whether it's healing or some secret bit of knowledge. In fact, the crowds have gotten so crazy that Jesus is now in this scene on a boat. He's a little bit offshore, and he's taking advantage of the great acoustics that come with being on a boat, but also it gives him some space from the crowds, and it allows him to teach more people all at once. The text tells us that people are cramming the shore, and that even some are on boats pressing in to hear him. Now the text reads like this: "Again he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables, and in his teaching he said to them, 'Listen.'" Okay, now we're going to pause right there and talk just briefly about parables. Now first, it's worth noting that parables were a common teaching method in the ancient world. Rabbis used them, the ancient Greek philosophers used them. Now, a parable is a fictitious story that's designed to illuminate a principle or a moral. It's supposed to help give people handles for something. Now, Jesus uses them for a couple different reasons. First of all, they're sticky. People remember stories. They remember illustrations. It's an easy way to take the abstract and make it simple, to make it plain, or to take something that's hard to understand and make it accessible. Now, Jesus doesn't just use parables to take something complex and make it simple. He actually seems to be doing the opposite. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute, but first it's worth noting that Jesus is doing this because he wants to draw people into relationship with him. So he speaks in hard to understand parables because they encourage people to pursue, to ask the follow-up question, to enter into a relationship with him. And it discourages the crowds who are really just there to get something from Jesus. Jesus wants people to want to know him for him, not for the thing that they can get from him. And so these parables, it's a great way to do that. Now, Jesus uses parables specifically to begin to reveal truths about his identity, about what the kingdom of God is like, and more specifically, about what he's like. He's not interested in being used. He's interested in being known. And so these parables reveal a bit about who he is and what he's about in a way that encourages relationship and not just interesting tidbits. Here's the thing with Jesus. He's not interested in his preaching primarily in conveying information. He's interested in transformation. Good Christian preaching does the same thing. It doesn't just inform people of something clever, but it seeks to transform over time. Now let's read this first parable, the parable of the sower. Jesus says, "Listen. A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing, and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And he said to them, 'He who has ears to hear, let him hear.'" Now this parable of the sower, is told to the crowds. And then Mark immediately brings us to a scene change in verse 10. Now Jesus is with a much smaller crowd. He was alone except for the disciples and those who are around him. Mark says it like this: "And when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables." So you see, we've got a much smaller group now. Jesus has withdrawn from the big crowds, and he's basically alone except for those closest to him. And those who are closest to him ask him about the parable. And Jesus said to them, this is verse 11, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven." Now first, this withdrawing and bringing those most interested and most committed with him is a pattern that we've already seen. We saw that back in episode 4 when we were discussing what faith looks like. Faith looks like pursuing Jesus. seeking Jesus. And that's what the disciples and those closest are doing. They're pursuing Jesus. They're taking steps of faith after him. Now, Mark wants to show us what faith looks like. It looks like seeking Jesus, following Jesus, pressing into relationship with Jesus. Not for the show or to get what I want, but for him. And that's what we see here. They pursue Jesus, and then they ask him. They ask the follow-up question about the parable. And Jesus responds by letting them in on a secret, by telling them a little bit more about himself and the kingdom of God. In fact, now the disciples know more about him and who he is than anyone but the demons, who, as we've seen so far in Mark's gospel, know who Jesus is, but Jesus won't let them tell anyone. Okay, before we get to Jesus's explanation of the parable, let's talk about the secret of the kingdom of God. Jesus says to the disciples, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom." That's in verse 11. But then Jesus goes on to say that the purpose of parables is so that they won't get it. And here he's referencing Isaiah chapter 6. Okay, now, so what actually is the secret of the kingdom of God? Mark doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us. He leaves us wondering. He leaves that hanging. He leaves it for us to figure out. Here's what I think. I think the secret is the very announcement that Mark made back in chapter 1, verse 1. The king has come. Or to put it in a more nuanced way, the kingdom of God has come and is coming in the person, word, and work of Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, the king himself. Jesus is what, or more specifically, who has been given to the disciples. That word there, given, is really important. Jesus is the gift. If the secret has been given, well, what's the gift? Jesus himself is the gift, the king who's been given for his people. The secret of the kingdom, the secret that Jesus has insisted the demons keep hidden for the last 3 chapters of Mark, is Jesus' identity as the king. Now, the explanation of the parable itself. We're going to move quickly here. Mark writes, starting in verse 13, "And he said to them, 'Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word, and these are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones on the rocky ground, the ones who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. And they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. But those that were sown on the good soil are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. All right, now to the explanation of the parable. This is starting in verse 13. Jesus said that the sower is sowing the word. The Greek is logos, and this is the word preached. We know back from episode 1 that preaching is Jesus's primary ministry, or certainly one of his primary ministries, and he's sowing the word when he preaches. And Jesus goes on to say that Satan himself is actively opposing the sowing of the word. Now, the rocky soil responds with joy first. This is good, but there's no root or endurance. Now, the Greek word for endure here, proskairos, means only for a temporary time, for a season. So the rocky soil are those who respond for a season, but for whom the faith doesn't take root or stick. And they fall away on account of hardship or tribulation. Life just gets hard and they can't endure. Now, verse 18, Jesus describes the thorny soil. Now, if your heart is thorny, if that's the state of your heart, the soil of your heart, then you do grow, but you're distracted easily and quickly by the cares of the world. Distractions, desires of the flesh, money, riches, it chokes out the word that had taken root in the soil of your heart. Now, note here in verse 18, the description of the thorny soil is that this seed isn't fruitful. It grows, but it doesn't bear fruit. Fruit is the identifier of a healthy growing plant versus a thorny plant. I wonder how many of us think that we're healthy and growing, but we're not bearing fruit. We're distracted from fruit bearing by the cares of the world. And so maybe perhaps our hearts are thorny. And then lastly, good soil. Good soil produces a massive return, 30-fold, 60, 100-fold. This is incredible. It's not growing by addition, it's growing by multiplication. It's exponential. Now, good soil, healthy soil, does 3 things. First, if your heart soil is healthy, you hear the word. That's the first thing, is you've got open ears ready to receive. And that's the second thing that you do. You receive it. You don't just hear it, but you actually take it in. there's a pattern here. To receive is to be given a gift. And after we receive the gift, good soil bears fruit. Now, bearing fruit, the Greek tense there is present and active, but only after the passive hear and receive comes first. Lastly, the bearing of fruit here is exponential. It's multiplicative, and exponential growth starts with 1. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16. It's not like I myself have to bear 100 pieces of fruit, so much as I bear fruit. That fruit in turn bears fruit. That's how multiplication works and exponential growth works. This is the cycle of discipleship. Disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And that's how it's possible to bear fruit 30, 60, and 100 fold. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What type of soil is your heart? Are you rocky, distracted by the hardships and tribulations of the world? Are you thorny, easily distracted by things of the flesh? Or is your soil fruitful, ready to hear, respond, and then bearing fruit? Thanks so much for joining me in this episode of the 10-Minute Bible Study. This is part 1 of a 2-part episode. We'll continue with the parables next time. If this has been helpful for you, please like, share, subscribe, and comment, and we'll see you soon.